Today we're talking about the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, and particularly about women's involvement in reform movements during this time period. The Progressive Era, of which you've already seen a video to give you background, was an era roughly from the 1880s to the 1920s that involved many movements. It was a strong response to changes in American society, to a growth of population, to urbanization, and to industrialization. And it contained reform movements focused on a variety of issues. There were many political reforms: the call for referendum and recall, for civil service exams, for a city manager system to clean up American cities. There were economic reforms. There were efforts at trust busting, breaking apart of large corporations for the advantage of the American economy. Regulation laws like the Pure Food and Drug Act, and labor reform to change the hours and conditions of work. Most particular to females were social reforms, movements like temperance, which was the reduction in drinking and eventually led to prohibition. For Americanization, efforts to help immigrants become more American through settlement houses and other programs. The anti-lynching campaign to stop the lynching of African Americans, particularly in the South. A campaign to raise the age of consent at which young women could agree to become married and thus sexually active, and the birth control movement. There were other progressive era reforms as well, including environmental movements. Far too many movements to discuss here, but I'm going to give you a couple case studies to help you to understand women's involvement in progressive era reform. Why would women in their separate sphere of the household become reformers? Well, Kathleen McCarthy asked the same question in her article on women in reform that covered a much larger time period. But focusing in on the progressive era, we see several trends worth noting. One is that women often became involved in issues that touched on children in the home. If it had to do with child welfare, with wives, with mothers, or with motherhood, those issues were considered women's issues and therefore appropriate for female input. There were also views that women could be a positive influence. In the case of immigrants, it was hoped that a wife could positively affect her husband. In the case of Native Americans, the same ideas were put into place. Women were viewed as more religious, as more pure, and therefore as a positive influence. Women, in fact, took control of religion in terms of the upbringing of children and the religious influence within the household. Women also benefited from large networks of support. That same old female world of love and ritual meant that women had friends they could count on to help them in their reform movements, to help them fund and to help them attend and to get the work done. There were also certain political and economic powers given to organizations, so that while women could not sign contracts, often could not speak publicly, as the leader of an organization, they could borrow money, sign contracts, and make public statements. So reform was an avenue for power and expression for women. The first case study I want to look at is the settlement house. Settlement houses were the stereotypical progressive institution. These were large homes built in poor immigrant neighborhoods where women who were reformers would go to live. This was not housing for the poor. Rather, it was housing for reformers who wanted to live amongst the poor. When we think of settlement houses, we think of the 3 R's: residency, research, and reform. Residency applies to the fact that the reformers would take up residency in poor neighborhoods so that they could better research them, get to know the people around them, what their problems were, and how they might be fixed, and then institute reforms to fix them. The old idea that people were poor because they were bad, lacking, or morally insufficient gave way to a recognition that problems like poverty, crowding, and a lack of sanitation caused many of the problems in the urban environment. The goal of all progressive movements was to fix problems. And in the case of the settlement house, the goal was to fix the problems of urban growth and new immigrants. They focused on the needs of children, of better housing and sanitation, of English and education. Many settlement house programs were run by women, although there were men involved in the settlement house movement. Women started kindergartens for small children, offered milk wells where families could get inexpensive, wholesome milk. They started savings banks and offered English classes, so that a settlement house was a community center offering a variety of servants to its immigrant clientele, run by women. Many of the programs in the settlement house also focused on women. Educational classes were given to mothers on the proper foods to cook, the way to clean home, on wives and on housekeepers, so that the hope was women would improve the family situation. I should also note that many settlement house workers were amongst the first generation of college-educated females, women who went to college themselves to study social work and social problems and came out looking for a way to make a difference. As such, the settlement house was a perfect location for educated and activist women to get involved in issues close to home. My second case study is about the age of consent. There is a shift from the Victorian era to the Progressive era in terms of views of women. In the Victorian era, women were viewed as very religious and very wholesome. If anything, they needed to be protected, and when they were preyed upon by men, they needed to be reclaimed. Victorian reformers might have helped prostitutes return to a more normal life. In the Progressive era, there was a recognition that we could fix the problem by being more proactive. And the solution was to raise the age of consent, which in some states was as low as 12, 13, or 14, to something closer to 16 or even 18, so that girls could not consent to sexual activity or marriage until such an age, and thus could be better protected from men who preyed upon them. The effort was instead to avoid the fall, rather than later reclaiming the fallen. There were some problems specific to this age. Working girls, girls who worked in stores, for instance, faced problems as men could come into those stores, show off cash in an effort to pick them up. The solution, according to wealthy reformers, was to reach out and befriend these girls, to teach them the right habits and the right ways, to offer them entertainment so they wouldn't rely on men and their finances for entertainment. It was believed that wealthy women could exert a power over poor women by example, helping to understand how better to live and to resist the temptations of the urban life. Women used petitions to try to get laws changed, particularly consent laws. Since they were not allowed to vote, and they certainly weren't serving in political office, they found ways around that by circulating petitions to encourage the laws that they supported, and by applying political pressure to their husbands and to male politicians. Their idea was that together they could fix problems and save young women from lives of ill repute. Like settlement houses, the campaign to change the age of consent gives us a vision of women, the kinds of issues they believed they could appropriately be involved in, the ways in which they found alternative avenues to power since they couldn't vote or hold office, and the ways in which they viewed women victims or women clients as being able to be influenced by the better sort. There are no questions during this period there were a lot of changes facing women. Women were working outside the home in factories and shops and for wages. This influenced their access to money, but also their position in the home. There was also growing education for women. More and more girls stayed in school through high school, and as universities accepted their first female candidates, professions like social work opened up to wealthy women who chose to pursue a career instead of a marriage. For the first time, single women had some options. There was also growing power for women, though they couldn't vote or hold office. Through petition and through public action, protest march and public speaking, they found their voice in a public arena. Thus, while the spheres remained separate and women remained in control of the home, inroads into the public outside in the male sphere were being made. We do want to remember that there were class and racial elements, however, to progressive reform. Reformers were often middle or upper class women who had their own ideas and looked down upon immigrant and minority women. When women pushed for the right to vote, white women often suggested that it was important they could vote so they could overpower the votes of immigrant men and women who were lesser. There were racial divisions within the suffrage movement as well as within reform movements. Just because women shared their gender didn't mean they shared all their points of view.